Hello, today we will be reviewing the third section of Chapter 15 in Psychological Disorders. And to begin with, we are going to go over what schizophrenia is and what it looks like, the symptoms that are associated with individuals that experience schizophrenia, and also talking about personality disorders. And so when we talk about schizophrenia, two or more of the following are present for a significant portion of time during a 1 month period or less if treated successfully. So this may include delusions, which are false beliefs that are often bizarre or grandiose, that's maintained in spite of its irrationality, hallucinations, disorganized speech, where the individual experiences a severe disruption of verbal communication in which their ideas shift rapidly, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, so almost sitting still, not able to move voluntarily. They also may experience negative symptoms, so they have affective flattening or aphasia, where they have an inability to speak or understand. They also, oftentimes when we see individuals that are experiencing schizophrenia, often have a distorted perception of reality, altered or blunted emotions, so they may just not show any emotion on their face, and they experience significant disturbances in thought, motivation, and behavior. And so schizophrenia actually only occurs in about 1% of the population. So again, it's a very low prevalence or base rate of individuals actually experiencing clinically significant symptoms or levels of schizophrenia. And this comes into contrast with what we see in media or on news or televisions, because we're bombarded with individuals with these symptoms, but what we see is that it actually doesn't occur that often. So here are, again, those symptoms: the delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech. And so delusions of personality may include that they believe they are the Messiah, that they are Joan of Arc. These delusions of personality are why schizophrenia is often confused with multiple personalities or personality disorders that we'll talk about later. And so unlike these personality disorders, though, the adopted identities that the individuals take on with schizophrenia don't alternate or demonstrate amnesia for one another. And so they actually believe that they are this individual, and they only have one specific, or they may have several, but they don't alternate between them. So they also have delusions of persecution, which are also common. So belief that the CIA, demons, aliens are conspiring to harm them or their family. Individuals with schizophrenia have little to no insight into their disorder or distorted perceptual and thought processes, and that's why they develop these unusual beliefs. So here we'll talk more about grossly disorganized behavior and negative symptoms. So with grossly disorganized behavior, this may look like constant childlike silliness, improper sexual behavior, disheveled appearance, loud shouting or swearing. Specific motor disturbances might include strange movements, rigid posturing, odd mannerisms, bizarre grimacing. Catatonic behavior is related to that rigid posturing, and this is a marked decrease in all movement or an increase in muscular rigidity or overactivity. So people with catatonia may actively resist movement. So when someone's trying to move their arm, they cannot move their appendage, or they may become completely unresponsive and unaware of their surroundings. So they may become in a catatonic stupor. Patients receiving drug therapy also may exhibit motor symptoms such as rigidity or spasms as a side effect of their medication. The next set of symptoms that we see on the slide are negative symptoms, and so these refer to things that are missing in people or individuals with schizophrenia. So they have a lack of affect, so they show no emotion. And this is not in the way that we say people don't show emotion. This is, no, they have a flat affect. They have flat responses where they are not answering to anything. They are completely like checked out. And so their ability to act willfully may be reduced, their interest in people or events undermined, or their capacity to focus attention is impaired when they're experiencing these almost episodes of schizophrenia. So there's various symptoms of schizophrenia that don't all occur in every case. Instead, the disorder can actually take quite different forms. So recent editions of the DSM have identified 5 main subtypes of schizophrenia and include paranoid, catatonic, disorganized, undifferentiated, and residual. So 3 of these types depend primarily on the relative prominence of various symptoms. So with paranoid, the prominent feature is delusions and hallucinations. This also may look like a preoccupation with one or more delusions or frequent auditory hallucinations, so hearing things. And catatonic, the prominent features involve movements or immobility. So if someone sits for hours with their head in their hands and doesn't move a muscle, that may be a type of catatonic behavior. And when a nurse tries to pull their head up, they resist that movement. This is an example of catatonic behavior. And the next one that we see with disorganized, the prominent features are disorganized speech, disorganized behavior, and flat or inappropriate affect. And so the DSM reserves the undifferentiated types of cases that for individuals that don't neatly fall into one of these categories, and the residual type for individuals who have substantially recovered from at least one schizophrenic episode but still have lingering symptoms. So they're not yet fully out of the episode but are still experiencing some symptoms. So with hallucinations, these are false perceptual experiences that have a compelling sense of being real despite the absence of anything actually stimulating the senses. And so hearing, seeing, smelling, or feeling things that aren't really there. They're often auditory, so hearing voices no one else can hear. 65% of people or individuals with schizophrenia report hearing voices repeatedly. Research suggests that voices are in fact produced in the mind of the individual. In a PET imaging study, auditory hallucinations were accompanied by activation in the Broca's area. So again, this is that production of language area. But the voice usually doesn't sound like your own voice, more like an uncle offering advice or making snide comments. And so what we see with hallucinations, again, these are false perceptual experiences. So when we talk about biological and psychological factors, Kraepelin actually discovered schizophrenia and first described this syndrome, and he remarked that it was so severe that it must be organic or biological. Over the years, accumulating evidence suggests that he was largely correct in his findings. And so family studies indicate that relatives are more likely than non-relatives to develop the disorder. The estimates vary considerably across studies, but almost every study suggests higher concordance rates for identical than fraternal twins, suggesting that there is actually a genetic component to developing schizophrenia. Evidence also suggests that the prenatal environment also plays a large role in the development or the susceptibility or vulnerability to developing schizophrenia. So one example of this is that because approximately 70% of identical twins share the same prenatal blood supply, toxins in the mother's blood could contribute to the high concordance rate. When one twin develops schizophrenia and the other does not, birth records often show that the afflicted twin was the second born and had a lower birth weight. So when we look at the risk of developing schizophrenia, this is a nice illustration because we see that individuals that are first-degree relatives, if you have an individual that has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, then we have a higher rate or risk of developing or being vulnerable to developing schizophrenia as opposed to second-degree relatives and third-degree relatives. And if you do share the same DNA as an identical twins, then you almost have a 50-50 chance of developing schizophrenia. So continuing on with biological and psychological factors, we have, during the 1950s, professionals found that tranquilizers lowered levels of dopamine, which then reduced the symptoms of schizophrenia. This finding led to the development of the dopamine hypothesis, which states that schizophrenia involves an excess of dopamine activity in the brain. So thus, lowering levels of dopamine reduces symptoms of schizophrenia. However, considerable evidence suggests that this hypothesis is inadequate or doesn't explain all of what we see with schizophrenia. So thus, researchers believe that the disorder involves a complex interaction among a lot of different biochemicals. Scientists have discovered that actually Broca's area, as we mentioned earlier, is activated when the patient is experiencing current auditory hallucinations. And when we look at neuroimaging, the enlarged ventricles are often only found in some patients with schizophrenia, and this can actually be caused by long-term use of antipsychotic medication. So it's not that individuals with large ventricles are more susceptible to schizophrenia, but it may be the other way around. So taking that medication may have been caused by this long-term use of it, and as a result, these individuals have larger ventricles. And so when we also talk about schizophrenia and talking about the prevalence, again, we said it occurs in about 1% of the population, and it's slightly more common in men than women. Early versions of the DSM suggested that schizophrenia may have a very early onset in the form of infantile autism, but more recent research suggests that the disorders are distinct and that schizophrenia really develops before early adolescence. The first episode typically occurs in late adolescence or early adulthood. Despite its relatively low frequency, schizophrenia is the primary diagnosis for nearly 40% of all admissions to state and county hospitals, and it's the second most frequent diagnosis for inpatient psychiatric admissions. This disproportionate rate of hospitalization is a testament to the devastation that it can cause in an individual's life. Important to note that some of the symptoms occur in people without this disorder. In one study of 375 college students, 71% reported hearing brief, occasional hallucinations of hearing voices during periods of wakefulness, and 39% heard their own voice or their own thoughts being spoken aloud. And delusional thoughts occur outside of schizophrenia as well. So, for example, in a sample of 6,000 adults, 50% of them expressed a belief in thought transference, 25% said they believe in ghosts, and 25% believe in reincarnation. So we oftentimes see these symptoms outside of this diagnosis, yet it does not equal or mean that that individual meets criteria for the diagnosis. So here we move on to talking about personality disorders that sometimes share symptoms with other disorders that we've already talked about. And so personalities are good, they make us different and interesting, but when personality traits become overly rigid and defining, we define them as personality disorders. These are diagnoses that are characterized by deeply ingrained, inflexible patterns of thinking, feeling, or relating to other people. When we look at personality disorders, they're the most controversial classifications in the DSM for several reasons. So critics question whether your personality can actually be a disorder, given that 14.8% of the U.S. population has a personality disorder according to the DSM. That is an extremely high prevalence rate of these disorders. So is it a problem? Are personality disorders real, or is it more of the DSM diagnostic criteria that we have is not yet finite in terms of figuring out who is actually experiencing a true personality disorder? So another question is whether such problems can be classified into distinct types, or if they're better understood as extreme values along trait dimensions, such as the Big Five or five-factor model. And with DSM-5, they've made efforts to more or less understand these traits on this continuum of high, average, low. And finally, definitions of many personality problems share characteristics, as we mentioned earlier, with major disorders and may just be milder forms of these conditions. Over half of the people or individuals with a mood or anxiety disorder also have a comorbid personality disorder. Over half of the people that have been diagnosed with mood or anxiety disorders also have a comorbid personality disorder. We also have talked about this in the personality chapter, but diagnosis or assessment of personality disorders is difficult, and it's complicated by the fact that many people with personality disorders don't actually admit that they have them, or they don't understand that their problems may be caused or may be due to their personality. And so many of these people or individuals do not actually realize that they may create problems for themselves or disturb people around them. And to solve this problem, many researchers use peer nomination or have others report on their behavior. And so when we talk about personalities, there's specific clusters of personality disorders, and they include these three. And the DSM lists 10 personality disorders that fall into these three clusters: odd, eccentric, dramatic, erratic, and anxious or inhibited. So when we talk about the odd, eccentric cluster, this includes schizotypal, paranoid, and schizoid. And so schizotypal is where we have peculiar or eccentric manners of speaking or dressing, strange beliefs. We also see magical thinking, so the belief that the individual has ESP or telepathy. They have difficulty forming relationships, may react oddly in conversation, may not respond or talk to themselves. Paranoid is what we would often think of with an individual that's paranoid, but they have a distrust in others. They have suspicion that people will have ulterior motives or sinister motives. They challenge the loyalties of friends and read hostile intentions into others' actions, prone to anger and aggressive outbursts, otherwise emotionally cold. And so that also talks about paranoid. But with schizoid, what we see is this extreme introversion and withdrawal from social relationships, prefers to be alone with little interest in other people. They may be described as humorless, distant, often absorbed with their own thoughts and feelings. They may be characterized as a dreamer. They are fearful of being close to individuals, have poor social skills, and seen as a loner. Next, we talk about histrionic, which is narcissistic. So these are more well-known personality disorders, but these are more of the overly dramatic, attention-seeking, and enthusiastic. So histrionic, you can almost think of it in a mania or manic type behavior. With narcissistic, this is that inflated sense of self-importance and achievement that we often hear other people saying, "Oh, you're just, a narcissist," or "You're narcissistic." But with true narcissistic personality disorder, what we see with this is that they go to great lengths to inflate their own self-esteem while exploiting other people. And so here we have the dramatic erratic cluster with borderline and antisocial personality disorders. And so borderline, we have see unstable emotions and relationships with borderline personality disorder. We also see antisocial personality disorder, and these within more broadly, personality disorders are known to be more difficult to treat because they are long-lasting, but more this dramatic erratic cluster, these are more of the disorders that are more difficult to treat of the personality disorders in and of themselves. And especially with the antisocial personality disorder, these individuals may have had a history of conduct disorder in adolescence, a lack of regard for others' rights, and lack of empathy for other people. So oftentimes individuals may describe them as a sociopath or psychopath. So Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer may be examples of individuals with antisocial behavior. We also may think of Hannibal Lecter or Dexter. We also may think of Charles Manson in this way as well. And so to go into more symptoms of each of these two, with the borderline personality disorder, individuals experience unstable moods or emotions, intense, stormy personal relationships, frequent mood changes and anger, unpredictable impulses, self-mutilation or suicidal threats or gestures in order to get attention or to manipulate other people. They have a self-image that fluctuates and tendency to see others as all good or all bad, nothing in between. And so one example of this may be Sandra, who picked a fight with her boyfriend for no apparent reason. She screamed over and over again that she hated him and then kicked him out of her apartment. Showed up at his apartment and threatened to kill herself if he actually decided to leave her. And so this is more of that erratic behavior, unstable mood, or self-mutilation in order to get attention or to manipulate another individual. And in terms of antisocial personality disorder, here are some more key diagnostic criteria that we may see with this particular disorder. And so the DSM suggests that any pattern of extreme disregard for other people should be considered a personality disorder, and labels this as the antisocial personality disorder. And this is, again, a flagrant just disregard and violation of the rights of other people, and begins in childhood or early adolescence and continues into adulthood. And adults with APD or antisocial personality disorder typically have a history of conduct disorder before the age of 15. So they experience problems of aggression, destruction of property, rule violations, and deceitfulness, lying and stealing, even when they were at a young age. In adulthood, APD is given to individuals who show 3 or more of the following signs: illegal behavior, deception, impulsivity, physical aggression, recklessness, irresponsibility, and lack of remorse for wrongdoing. It occurs in about 3.6% of the general population, with men being diagnosed 3 times as often as women are. And so when we also look at antisocial personality, again, we often characterize them as a sociopath or a psychopath, individuals with APD who are especially ruthless but charming. And so the terms sociopath and psychopath describe people with APD who are especially cold-hearted, manipulative, and ruthless, yet may be very charming. Many people with APD do commit crimes, and many are caught because of the frequency and the flagrancy of their infractions. And among 22,790 prisoners in one study, 47% of men and 21% of women were diagnosed with APD. These kinds of stats are why some people term APD the criminal personality. So when we talk about the causes of APD being related to conduct disorder, it may also be linked with an early onset and lack of success in treatment that suggests career criminality as an internal cause. This is because there's accumulating evidence of brain abnormalities in people with APD. One line of investigation has looked at sensitivity to fear in psychopaths versus those who show no psychopathology. Both groups were shown words of negative emotions such as hate or corpse. Those with APD exhibited less activity in the amygdala and hippocampus than non-criminals. So both of these brain areas, again, are involved in fear conditioning. And this suggests that psychopaths are less sensitive to fear than other people. Important to note are those that do have this diagnosis often target their aggression towards the self as well as other people, and often engaging in reckless behaviors that lead to violent ends. So this lack of fear is detrimental to themselves as well. The last cluster is the anxious inhibited cluster. And so avoidant, we see socially anxious and uncomfortable individuals and less confident of being liked. They fear criticism and worry about being embarrassed in front of other people, avoid social situations due to fear of rejection. So this, again, based on these symptoms, this also sounds like social anxiety disorder, which is another problem with these symptoms and this diagnostic criteria. Dependent personality disorders are individuals that are submissive, dependent on other people, requiring excessive approval, reassurance, and advice from others. They cling to other people because they have a fear of losing them. They lack self-confidence and uncomfortable when being alone. The third and last anxious inhibited cluster personality disorder is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And so this is related in some symptoms to OCD, but it is not OCD. So with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, these individuals are conscientious, they are very orderly, perfectionistic, they have excessive need to do everything right, whatever right is in their mind, their definition. They have inflexibly high standards, and caution can interfere with their productivity. So they have to make everything so perfect that they spend hours making sure that their homework does not have any mistakes, rewriting it over and over again. And they may have a fear of errors that make them strict and controlling, and they have a poor expression of emotions. And so with that wraps up the last section on psychological disorders.